Welcome to another installment of Donning the Armor. This morning we will begin in Judges chapter 8, verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." So, where we last left off, Gideon had this great victory over the kings of Midian. Gideon put them to the blade. Gideon went with 300 men, caused mass confusion over their fear of him, caused them to kill each other and then flee, caused the other tribes to come together and slay them on the way. Then went through 2 Israelite cities who would not help them, which is how we kind of know that it was not exactly one day, that this probably took quite some time to all happen. That this was really battle-hardened Gideon over time, because he did not feel he was a great man of valor. But he comes back a conquering hero. And now, as God had said, if I gave you these 32,000 people, initially, everyone would think that they did it by their own hand and not by me. And now even with 300 men in Gideon, even as he came through with this group, with the other tribes joining in, here they have the combined men of Israel, these elders, these representatives of the different tribes saying, now we want you to rule over us. Both you and your son and your grandson basically become a royal lineage, become our king in perpetuity, become what these other nations have, this line of kings, because you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. Already claiming victory out of the hand of God and placing it into the hand of man, removing the glory of God and assigning it to Gideon himself. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So Gideon's answer is no. We are not to have a king. The Lord is to be our king. The Lord is to rule our lives. The Lord is to come first. The Lord is the one to bring our plans together and profit us. Not a man, but the Lord Almighty. And it's an amazing sentiment. It's a true statement. But we will see very quickly how Gideon falters very fast in this very thing. That I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. The Lord is your God. That is the man who is to be your God, is the Lord. Or to be your king is God. God is to be your king, to rule over you for all time. Not a man, God. Not an infallible creation. Not a fallible creation, but the infallible King of kings and Lord of lords. Then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings of his plunder. For they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So all the plunder of these Ishmaelites, the earrings taken out of their ears, the nose rings taken out of their noses, all of the things that they had taken as plunder in the battle, he would like all of that gold. So they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw in it the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around the camels' necks. Then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in his city, Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more, and the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. That quickly. From mighty victory, conquering hero, to falling into idolatry. Making an ephod, making a priestly garment. He is not a priest. He is not a Levite. He is not of the bloodline of Aaron. And there is a high priest at this time. We don't hear about the priesthood or the high priest during the book of Judges. We don't hear about them very often, if at all. They don't take a central role. And with the people constantly turning to idolatry left and right, you got to wonder just how strong that priesthood was. After Joshua, after Eleazar, after Phinehas, how quickly did that priesthood crumble in its ability to sway the hearts and minds of people? Gideon called to destroy the altar of Baal, to burn an image of Baal, destroy the altar, cut down the idol, burn it to make an offering. Gideon, not a priest, but he sees that taking of that liberty to make an offering as making him a priest over the people in a way, to make an ephod the symbol of their victory. But symbols often quickly become idols. And all Israel played the harlot with it. It became a snare to each and every one of them, even his own household, even himself. This ephod became a snare, became something they idolized. So often it's victories we have that turn into idolatry. It's not just false gods, but it's anything we raise above God. What are we putting before the Lord? He subdued his enemies, but then he tripped up his own people. We're told in Kings and Chronicles that the bronze serpent of Moses became an idol to the people. That the bronze serpent itself became an idol. That thing of salvation became an idol because they worshipped it in place of God. And how sad to see a symbol, a foreshadowing of Christ, stealing away the worship from the coming Christ. Hezekiah would break it apart and just call it basically bronze rubbish, a bronze thing. It was not God. It was not to be worshipped as God. There are many Christian denominations, especially the Orthodoxy and the Roman tradition, the Roman denomination, that like to have these symbols of victory, these icons, they call them, because if you rename it an idol, an icon, apparently it makes it okay. But they worship at the feet of these things. Now, they are worshiping God. They are worshiping Christ. But they're playing the harlot with an idol. It's becoming a snare to them and their denominations, where they pray to that as a symbol, as a medium between them and God, instead of praying directly to the Lord himself. Instead of speaking to their Father, they speak to anything else they could find. They go in any direction they can to avoid speaking to their Father. What victories are we allowing in our lives, to become an ephod, to become an idol? What are we patching together that will become a snare for us, that'll pull us away from the true worship of the Lord, that'll keep us from speaking directly to our Father? The Lord, even with these snares, allowed the nation to be quieted and restful and peaceful for 40 years. Midian wasn't destroyed, they were subdued. They didn't lift their heads anymore. They kept themselves to themselves. They weren't completely destroyed. They weren't annihilated. They weren't wiped off the face of the earth. But the Lord kept their heads down, kept them away from his people for 40 years. All the while, the hero of the people, the one who said he would not take on the role of ruler because it is God who rules, creates his own trap by creating this vestment, this ephod, hanging it up in his home, in his city, causing a snare to himself and his people. This symbol of victory, this trophy of victory, to be something all people look to instead of looking to the Lord. Because in the human heart, we want something we can see. That's why the Israelites constantly wanted a king. They wanted a person. They wanted someone they could look to, someone they could see, someone they could hear, over the Lord who we feel more than hear. When he speaks to us, those of us who are honest, we don't hear his voice. We don't see his face. We feel his presence. Very few people have ever been lucky enough to have actually seen some kind of visage of the Lord, to have heard an audible voice. Because I'm sure there are people who have. But I do know from straight discernment and what people say that many of the people who claim to have had have not. But you have a God, a king, who you do not see, who you cannot hear, who you cannot feel, who you cannot hug, who is not physically there for you in the way that a man would be. And that causes harlotry. That causes a rot in our spiritual lives, because it's a want we wish to see filled. It's a desire and a hole we have, a hole that comes from our fallen, debased nature, that we long for something that Adam had that we do not, and that is to walk with God in the cool of the night, in the cool of the evening, in the garden. That's something Adam and Eve had, something we wish, but something we need to wait for and be patient about. Not something we are just given. What are we allowing? Work, success at work, success in sports. What are we holding on to that is causing us failure where it should be victory, where we should be happy in accepting the victory that the Lord has allowed us, instead of holding the victory up above our relationship with our own Father? Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, So no adopted sons, all his own sons. Don't know how many daughters, but 70 of his own sons. For he had many wives. So he added wives to himself. Of course, that's a commandment to a king. He is not a king, but still, we have had this discussion before, but and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Amalek. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age, and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father, in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So, the Old Testament, outside of Genesis, telling us that it is one man, one woman, Adam and Eve, created for each other to be one flesh. Outside of really that, because the New Testament does, the Old Testament doesn't always outright condemn polygamy. Doesn't condemn having all of these wives. And I've seen supposed Christians latch on to that and try to claim that men can have as many wives as they want, as many concubines as they want. That's not breaking any commandment of God. Only Jesus said that to even think with lustful thoughts of a woman who's not your wife is adultery. So as soon as you have the one wife, because their example would be, well, they're all my wife, so I'm not thinking lustfully about any of them. But as soon as you have the one wife, the second you want to add another one, you typically add them because they're beautiful and they're lovely, and you're now lusting after them in your mind before you're married. Therefore, you have already committed adultery by even the thought of having a second wife. So there's that. But that's the New Testament, once again, condemning it. What the Old Testament generally gives is shows us the horror of having multiple wives. It doesn't tell us explicitly, you're an idiot for having multiple wives. But what it does is shows us example after example after example of the horror that comes from having multiple wives and having concubines, and how it destroys and poisons everything around you. Hagar with Ishmael. Gideon's fighting against Ishmaelites right now. Hagar with Ishmael with Abraham. All of the horror and strife that came from Jacob having 4 wives, 2 wives and 2 concubines. The failure and fall of an entire nation because Solomon's wives and the idolatry they brought in to the nation. How often David found himself fallen and struggling because of his infidelity and his concubines and wives. We aren't told necessarily, hey, don't do this. But when you're given prime example after prime example after prime example of why this is a horrible thing to do, sometimes you want to use some context clues to figure that out. That God is not prescribing multiple wives. He's describing the horror of having all of these spouses and how it has not helped but has hindered his people at every turn with every major player in the Bible. I guess that works in more way than one. But with every major player in the Bible, all the concubines he hoards for himself, he finds himself in deep trouble because of the idolatry and the strife and the pain that they all bring. Not just between the wives, but between the children themselves. We'll see that with Absalom. We see that with Reuben and Benjamin, and all of them taking it out on Joseph in all of these different instances. Ishmael downplaying and mocking Isaac. What that was, we don't know. Was he harming him? We don't know. But whatever it was, it was causing strife in the household of Abraham. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals, and made Baal-berith their god. Baal-berith, the god of the covenant. So that after Gideon dies, they start to play harlot with the Baals immediately. And make, Baal is just foreign god, so they make the foreign god of the covenant their god. A new covenant God. Not the true covenant God. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Remember, that great Midianite army was not just Midianites. It was everyone around them coming against them, oppressing them, starving them out, that Gideon overran and destroyed and had victory over. Nor did they show any kindness to the house of Jerubbabel, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. They even forgot the very good that Gideon himself did. They had grown so wicked and so hard because he himself had set the snare that tripped them up, that they forgot the good he did, because he allowed the wickedness to take hold, saved them from oppression. But in the end, his statement of where was this God who forsaken us, he himself turned around and forsook God, pushed him to the side, so he could get comfortable in the success he had in life, in the provisions of the Lord that he began that came from his own hand, and his own success and his own provisions. He got complacent and fell into the same compromise Israel did again and again. So moving on to chapter 9. Then Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's brothers, and spoke with them and with all the family of the house of his mother's father, saying, Please speak in the hearing of all the men of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or that one reign over you. Remember, I am your own flesh and bone. So now we're going to get a stark reminder of why polygamy is so bad. Here's his I pronounced it correctly one time. Abimelech, he now is coming forward and going to his own brethren in Shechem and saying, look, do you want all 70 of the sons of Gideon ruling over you? Which they apparently had no intent of doing. And Gideon said that none of his line would reign over him. Or would you rather just have me, one of your own people, who will show you deference, who will show you and be loyal to you above all the other tribes of Israel, will show you this deference, who will give you free reign and be kind to you, my brethren. Make me your king. My father didn't want the kingship, but I will be king. Amalek, that's actually the correct pronunciation this time. Hopefully I stick with that. Amalek, his name means my father the king. So as Gideon goes on and names this son of this concubine, he names Amalek my father the king. Tells everybody, I don't want to be king. I'm not your king. God's your king. But then he names his son, basically saying, my father is your king. Meaning Gideon was your king. Do you want his other 70 sons ruling over you? Or do you want me ruling over you? Your own flesh and bone. From your own line, from your own people. And his mother's brothers spoke all these words concerning him in the hearing of all the men of Shechem. And their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, he is our brother. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. So they've decided, we are going to follow this man. This is our brother. So they gave him money from the temple of this foreign, idolatrous god, so he could hire wicked and reckless and worthless men to do his dirty work with him. So he can hire cutthroats and thugs to do his dirty work. Then he went to his father's house in Ophrah and killed his brothers, the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left because he hid himself. And all the men of Shechem gathered together, all of Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was in Shechem. So he takes these cutthroats. They kill his brothers. After all, he's just the son of a concubine. What does he care for them? He didn't grow up in Gideon's house. He grew up in Shechem with them. Shechem, away from all these more privileged brothers. But Jotham, the youngest, must have known they were coming, or he hid himself as they were coming through and killing the other sons. And he hid himself. But here go the men of Shechem, making Abimelech the king of Israel, the king over the men of Shechem, the king of the people, a king that the Lord does not even recognize. We're told Saul is the first king, because Saul is the first king that the Lord has honored and placed on the throne. The people wanted a king, he gave them a king. But in this is a man, a wicked person, taking a kingship for himself. And the Lord's going to allow it for a couple of years, so that the people can learn their lesson and learn just how far they fell when they chose this disreputable and disgusting human being as their king. Now when they told Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim. He lifted his voice and cried out, and he said to them. So when it was told to Jotham in his hiding that Abimelech had been made king, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim, where they had pronounced the blessings and the cursings in the time of Joshua. Mount Gerizim, which would be a natural amphitheater, which would carry his voice out throughout the valley of Shechem. And he gives this prophetic utterance to these people, what is called the parable of the trees, but it's also very prophetic in what he tells them is coming. Listen to me, you men of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went forth to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, should I cease giving my oil, with which they honor God and men, that I to go sway over trees? So once there's these people, these trees, this forest, once a king among trees. And they go to the olive tree, who gives the oil of the anointing, the oil that is so prevalent among the priesthood, that is so prevalent among the worship of the Lord. And they say, olive tree, reign over us. And the olive tree, who is abundantly blessed and has plenty of provisions and would be such a great candidate, says, why should I cease giving my oil, this oil which honors God, which honors men? Why should I cease from my work that honors God to reign over these trees? God is what comes first. Then the trees said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, should I cease my sweetness and my good fruit, to go sway over trees? So the fig tree, good and fruitful, bearing many fruit, caring for the nourishment of the people. Should I cease being sweet? Should I cease in my fruitfulness and my provision for the people, in my sustenance and nourishment of the people? This great work I do on behalf of the Lord, should that cease so I can just be a tree amongst trees? Then the trees said to the vine, "You come and reign over us." But the vine said to them, "Should I cease my new wine, which cheers both God and men, to go sway over trees? Should I cease this juice, this drink that is offered before the Lord, that quenches the thirst of men? This new wine, which in all essence is actually grape juice. New wine is newly fresh crushed wine. It's not fermented enough to have the alcoholic content of wine that would make people drunk. This would be new, fresh table wine, which is not very potent. It is basically a slightly stronger grape juice. But should I cease these things that are offered to the Lord and to men, this great provision of the Lord for his people, should I cease that just to sway over trees, just to be some ruler for men? Then all the trees said to the bramble, to the bush, "You come and reign over us." And the bramble said to the trees, "If in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade." So he's saying, of course, I'll be your king. Take shelter in my shade. It's a bush. It's not giving off much shade. You're crawling under it. It's useless. It cannot be over you because it's basically on the ground already. It's not fit to be king. It's not mighty as an oak. It's not tall as a redwood. It's not shading out the sun. It's a bush. It's not worthy of the honor you're trying to bestow upon it. If in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. And most forest fires are caused by the underbrush and the bramble. Most fires that take place and sweep through the western part of the United States don't come because of climate catastrophitis. It comes because of poor forest management. Forest fires need to happen for new life to take over. But then you need to go out and you need to remove the bramble. You need to remove the underbrush. Fires will happen. New life comes in. You see these pictures of fires and you see animals fleeing before the fires. But what happens is in the destruction that takes place, and then of fallen trees and in the ash, there are animals that live in that and make that their homes. They need that as part of their ecology. And from the fires, new plants grow in their place. Where once was tangled root drowning out and strangling other vines, now you have great excess and success and goodness growing in its place. But in this case, it's saying, I will devour, I will destroy. And when you do not, when somebody not worthy to rule comes in the power, one of the reasons they're not worthy to rule is they don't have the temperament to rule. So he's saying, if you really want me as king, fine. I'll be your king. I don't have the ability, the power, the temperament. I'm not a good candidate to be king, but I'll be it. But the second you let me down, my poor ability to be a leader will burn this place to the ground. Now, therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as he deserves, for my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. He's saying if you've acted in truth, if you've actually went through in sincerity and made Abimelech your king, if you have dwelt well with Jerubbaal and his house, if you've done all these things, if you had done these things, you've made this monster your king, this murderer your king. If you had done well for the man who risked your life, but you didn't, he brought you out of the hand of Midian by God. It was his leadership that brought you out. But now you've acted out and made this monster your king. But you have risen up against my father's house this day and killed his 70 sons on one stone, and made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the men of Shechem, because he is your brother. Then if you have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and with this house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. If everything I've heard is true, and this is how you repaid the house of Gideon, because of this bastard son of a female servant, because he's your brother, he's your brethren, you turned your back on the hero you once worshipped, then rejoice in your choice, and let him rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Shechem and Beth Milo, and let fire come from the men of Shechem and from Beth Milo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled, and he went to Beer and dwelt there for fear of Abimelech his brother. If you've truly joined with him, great. Let you guys rejoice in each other. But if you haven't, there's any inkling of anything that's going wrong, of any sign of disloyalty, there will be fire to come. It would devour you, the men of Shechem, and Beth Milo, and it will consume Abimelech himself. And with that, Jotham runs away, his prophetic statement uttered into the wind, and he goes to Beer. And that's the last we hear from him. He leaves to let these two groups destroy each other, to let the fires of their wickedness rage. Gideon might have set his own snare by creating that ephod, by creating something, a piece of iconography that they could worship. And his polygamy would end in the death of his 70 sons and end with one son taking a throne that he swore he would never sit on. Because Gideon said, I will not sit on the throne. My sons will not sit on the throne. My grandsons will not sit on the throne. But here goes Abimelech, sitting, becoming king. The Lord, we find out next, will allow him to sit there for 3 years. 3 years as a so-called king over the people. A ruler amongst his brethren. Because when wickedness comes, when people have forgotten the Lord, when people have pushed the Lord to the side, there's always somebody willing to step up, say the right thing, make the right appeal. Somebody who is not fit to be in a leadership position, who will come along and tickle the ears of the people and will lead them into the flames. We're warned about that in the end days, people will leave sound teaching to follow teachers who will tell them things that will tickle their ears, will tell them things they want to hear, will tell them things that'll make them feel good about themselves, because nobody wants to hear the condemnation of the truth of God. No one wants to hear conviction. They want to hear affirmation. And that's what Abimelech comes preaching. Affirmation for his brethren. Do you want these other people who live there to rule over you? Or do you want one of your own to rule over you? Do you want somebody to judge you who will judge you fairly? Or do you want someone who will look favorably on you, even if that person is not fit to be in the position they're looking for? We see all the times pastors falling from grace because of sin. And so long, pastors and priests, every denomination has been hit with it. But it doesn't end there. We see it in public schools. We see it in government. We see it in all forms of life. People being placed in positions they did not deserve because they tickled the ears of the right people and promised favorability to those who could get them into the position that they wish to have. The wickedness of desire and envy, the wickedness of not being content with needs being met, but with wants being desired. The wickedness of mankind to never be content in the blessings and leadership of the Lord, always seeking after the affirmation of men. Said pride and fear go hand in hand. People are afraid to go out looking a certain way. I don't look right. I'm not dressed properly to go to that place. My makeup isn't done. I don't have the right kind of suit. That's a fear of rejection combined with a pride that anybody cares what you look like outside of you. A fear of failure mixed with a pride of feeling you deserve to succeed. Because we want the success. And we want it to come with as little effort and with as little criticism as possible. Because we focus on our wants. We want the riches. That's why the prosperity gospel prospers in our nation and in places like Africa and Asia. You pray yourself rich. Here goes some verse out of Malachi. Sure, that verse is speaking specifically to Israel at a very specific time in their history, but sure, we can all be rich because we pray to prayer. Even though Jesus himself warned against wealth. and its corrupting nature, and those who turn and compromise from the true worship of God. We need to find a way to be content purely and perfectly in His provisions, in whatever manner they come, in whatever way they come, and with whatever He sees fit to bring to us. Because that is the provision we need, His provision. Because nothing is better than that, and no one knows what's best for us than He does. Don't worry about wants. Just live for the provision of our needs. Because what we need most will not be realized in this world. That's the problem with the prosperity gospel. The Lord could drop $80 million in my lap tomorrow, and I'd be ecstatic. I'd be so happy. It would change every aspect of my life. But at the same time, that's the curse. Because with the changing of my life, very often could come with the changing of the relationship I have with my Father. And it's what comes next in my relationship with Him that matters, not my circumstances here. Don't let success trip us up. Be that success coming from feats, financials, or anything else we could think of. Don't let them trip us up and become a snare. Because the only thing we need is the righteousness that comes from the blood of Christ, through the submission of our wills and our wants to His authority over our needs. So that's where we shall end it for this morning. I hope this was fruitful for you. I hope to see you back again next time. But until then, be blessed.